They say some houses grieve. You can hear it in the way the floorboards sigh at night, in the way the walls seem to inhale before they speak. When I came back to my mother's house after the funeral, I thought the creaks and whispers were just the sounds of a place remembering. But the house wasn't mourning her death. It was waiting for me to remember what she made everyone forget. The first night back, the storm came without warning, wind clawing at the shutters, rain pelting the roof like frantic fingers. That's when I heard it, a lullaby. A faint, trembling tune humming through the vents, one my mother used to hum when she thought I was asleep. Except this time, the voice was higher, childlike, two voices, humming in harmony. I froze on the stairs, hand clutching the banister. The sound was coming from the old baby monitor on the hallway table, cracked, covered in dust, long since unplugged. Yet its green light flickered faintly, steady as a heartbeat. I told myself it was just interference, static from the storm. But when I turned to go back to bed, I saw it, a small black ribbon tied neatly around the doorknob of my old bedroom. My mother used to tie those ribbons in my hair when I was little. She stopped after I turned 6. Around the same time, she stopped talking about the twins. Everyone in town always avoided that subject. I'd ask my mother about the photograph, the one where she is holding 2 babies that looked just like me, and she'd say, "We don't talk about them." When I asked why, her face would go pale and she'd whisper, "Because they never left." Now, standing alone in the flickering dark, that phrase crawled back into my mind. I thought she meant their memory. But when I found the 2 unmarked graves behind the house the next morning, I realized she meant something else. Something that still lingered, something that still wanted to be found. And somewhere above me, behind that locked attic door, I heard a faint knocking, 3 slow taps, and a whisper that almost sounded like my own voice calling back. The attic door had always been locked, sealed with a rusted latch and a single brass key that my mother kept on a thin chain around her neck. When I was little, I used to ask what was up there, but she would only shake her head and say, "That room is not for you." It became one of those unspoken laws of the house, a boundary even my curiosity feared to cross. Now, with her gone, the house felt heavier, like it had been holding its breath for years, waiting for me to notice what it was hiding. On the second night after her funeral, I stood in front of the attic door for the first time in decades, feeling that same childhood dread creep back under my skin. The air was colder there, dense with dust and something older, a stillness that didn't belong to any living thing. I reached out, tracing the carved grooves in the wood, and it felt almost warm, like it remembered being touched before. The lock was old, but not as impenetrable as memory made it seem. I found the key in her jewelry box, tucked inside a folded piece of parchment that smelled faintly of lavender and age. Written on the paper in her careful, slanted handwriting were 3 words. "Don't open alone," I laughed under my breath, half out of nerves, half because I didn't know what else to do. It sounded like the kind of thing she'd say to keep me out of trouble, but the more I stared at it, the less it felt like a warning and more like a plea. When I turned the key, it resisted for a moment before clicking softly, the sound almost disappointed, like the door had been waiting too long to stay closed. A gust of air brushed past me as I pushed it open, cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something metallic beneath it, like blood gone stale. The bulb, hanging from the ceiling, flickered weakly when I pulled the cord, throwing light across sheets draped over forgotten furniture and boxes that looked older than I was. Dust floated in the air like pale ash, and every step I took made the floor groan as though warning me to turn back. Against the far wall stood an old crib, white paint peeling, one leg slightly splintered, and beside it a rocking chair swaying slowly, though there was no draft strong enough to move it. My stomach tightened. The lullaby from the baby monitor played in my head, each note threading itself around the creak of that chair. On the shelf above the crib sat 2 porcelain dolls, both identical, blue glass eyes, cracked faces, and black ribbons tied around their necks, their heads tilted slightly as if listening. I stared at them too long and felt that strange, crawling sense that they were staring back. One had a faint smudge on its cheek, not dirt but something darker, a small fingerprint, as if a child had just touched it. My hand trembled when I reached toward the crib and brushed the blanket inside. It was cold, brittle, but beneath it was something firm. I pulled the fabric back and found an old rattle-tarnished silver engraved with the initials L and M. My mother never mentioned those initials. I tried to remember if the photo of her holding the twins had names written on the back, but the image came to me blank, like my mind had learned to skip over it. Suddenly, from somewhere in the dark corner of the attic, came the softest sound, a sigh, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. The rocking chair slowed, then stopped. The air shifted, and I could feel the weight of presence, as though someone had just stepped closer, unseen. I whispered, "Hello?" Before I could stop myself, and for a heartbeat, the silence answered back with a whisper of its own, a voice too soft to be human, but too deliberate to be the wind, repeating one word I couldn't mistake, my name. The morning after I opened the attic, I woke with the strange heaviness of unfinished dreams pressing against my chest. The air in my mother's house had changed. It carried the scent of damp soil, sharp and earthy, like the ground after rain even though the sky outside was clear. When I stepped into the backyard, sunlight fell weakly through the twisted limbs of the willow trees, but the light didn't reach the far corner of the property where the grass grew thicker, darker. I had avoided that part of the yard since I was a child because my mother never tended to it. She'd mow and prune everything except that patch, as though even the plants there didn't want to be disturbed. But that morning, something pulled me toward it. Maybe the same curiosity that made me open the attic door, or maybe something older, more instinctive, that whispered it was time to look. As I walked closer, the sound of the world seemed to fade. The wind dulled, the rustling leaves stilled, and even the crows perched on the fence quieted as though waiting. The grass reached my knees, damp and cool, and I could smell the rot of old roots underneath. Then I saw two small mounds rising unevenly from the earth, half hidden beneath years of creeping ivy. The soil around them was sunken, soft in the middle, and scattered across the surface were pale stones placed in no particular order. I crouched down, brushing the vines aside, and felt my stomach twist when I saw the faint markings carved into two flat slabs of rock. There were no names, no words, only the years 1989-1989 etched faintly, almost worn away by time. Two lives that began and ended within the same year. I didn't need to be told who they were. I knew. Somewhere deep inside, I'd always known. My mother never spoke of them directly, but her grief lived in the walls, in her silences, in the way she'd flinch at the sound of a baby crying on television. She kept their absence like a secret wound, never healing, never exposed. Kneeling in the dirt, I felt the weight of that silence pressing down. I wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, just my imagination shaping grief into patterns. But the ground itself seemed to hum faintly beneath my palms, as if remembering the rhythm of something once alive. There were remnants of something around the graves, old toys faded to near colorlessness, a cracked wooden block with the letter M carved into one side, and a child's shoe so small it could fit in my hand. They were arranged carefully, lovingly, as if someone had visited often, though the layer of dust and decay said otherwise. When I lifted the shoe, a spider scuttled out from underneath, and for a fleeting second I thought I heard soft giggling behind me, high-pitched, fleeting, carried by the air. I turned quickly, heart hammering, but no one was there. Only the willow branches, swaying without wind. As I stared at the graves, I noticed the ivy creeping over the edges of the stones formed strange patterns, curling into shapes that looked almost deliberate. It wound itself in mirrored lines, like twin spirals, one coiling clockwise, the other counterclockwise, meeting in the center. I reached out to pull a vine away, and when I did, my fingers brushed something cold, a small piece of metal buried just beneath the surface. I dug with my hands, pushing away the dirt until I unearthed a rusted locket. It snapped open easily, and inside were two tiny locks of hair, one tied with a black ribbon, the other with a white one. Beneath them was a faded photograph, barely visible, showing two infants lying side by side, their eyes closed, their faces peaceful but strangely identical. My throat tightened as I traced the image, noticing a faint shadow in the background, a shape that could have been my mother's hand hovering above them, or perhaps something else entirely, darker, longer, wrong. I sat there for what felt like hours, the sun moving behind the clouds until the whole garden dimmed. I didn't notice the temperature dropping until my breath started to fog in the air. Then came a sound so faint I almost mistook it for my imagination. The slow, dragging rhythm of something shifting beneath the soil. A single pebble rolled off the mound nearest me, landing softly on the grass. I froze, staring at the disturbed patch, and felt the pulse in my neck throb painfully hard. The ground stilled again, quiet, unbothered, as if mocking my fear. But in that moment I realized what unsettled me the most. Not the graves, not the strange artifacts, not even the whispers. It was the fact that both mounds looked too shallow, too recent. The soil didn't seem old enough to have been there for 30 years. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself that erosion and roots could make anything look newer, but my mind wouldn't stop circling back to that thought. I couldn't ignore how the grass above the graves seemed freshly disturbed, the earth loose, as though someone had dug there not long ago and filled it back hastily. My eyes caught a glint near the second mound, something metallic again, something small. I leaned forward, brushing the dirt aside until I uncovered another object. A button, dull silver, with an engraving that matched the pattern on the nursery curtain in the attic. My mother's sewing box had those same buttons. She used to make all my clothes by hand. That meant she'd been here, touching this earth, recently enough for her belongings to still surface from beneath it. When I stood up, I noticed the ivy behind the graves moving slightly, curling an unnatural rhythm. I stepped back, heart pounding, and the air seemed to pulse with that same faint hum, low and resonant, almost like two voices breathing in unison. I wanted to leave, to run back into the house, but something kept my feet rooted there. It wasn't fear exactly, it was recognition, a horrible sense of belonging. And then, as the last thread of sunlight vanished behind the clouds, I heard it again, that lullaby, distant and thin, drifting from nowhere and everywhere at once, the same one from the attic, only this time, two voices were singing softly beneath it, and both were calling me by name. That night, sleep felt like something foreign, something my body no longer remembered how to do. Every sound in the house seemed amplified, the ticking of the clock, the whisper of branches scraping the windows, the faint creaks of wood shifting under its own age. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, that the strange things I'd seen in the backyard were tricks of the mind, the kind grief plays when it wants company. But around midnight, a low hum began to bleed through the silence, so faint it almost blended with the static of my thoughts. It was music, slow, rhythmic, like a lullaby caught between frequencies. I sat up, heart thudding, and realized the sound was coming from the hallway, from the baby monitor. I hadn't touched that monitor since the day I found it flickering, yet now its faint green light glowed again, steady and alive. It shouldn't have been possible. There were no batteries inside, no power anywhere near it. Still, the light pulsed gently, matching the rhythm of the lullaby, as though it were breathing. I crept closer, the air growing colder with each step, until I could hear the sound clearly. Two voices, small, fragile, and sweet, humming together in perfect harmony. The same song my mother used to hum when I was little, the same song that played in my head the moment I opened the attic. I reached out and lifted the monitor, its plastic shell slick with a thin layer of dust. The voices cut off abruptly, replaced by static, soft at first, then sharp and crackling like whispering through broken glass. Beneath the noise, something formed, not words exactly, but the sound of breath close to the microphone, a child's exhale, deliberate, curious. Then a whisper, high and thin, just one word. "Mama!" My stomach dropped. I froze, listening, waiting for it to repeat, but the line went dead, leaving behind a silence thick enough to feel. The air smelled faintly of iron and something sweet, like milk left out too long. I placed the monitor back down, backing away slowly, but as soon as I reached the stairs, the lullaby started again, this time not through the monitor, but faintly echoing from upstairs. It drifted down like mist, curling around the banister, wrapping itself in the dark. I didn't want to go up there. Every instinct screamed to stay grounded, but something heavier than fear pulled me forward. The melody was so familiar it almost calmed me, almost made me forget how wrong it was to hear it now. Each step I took up the staircase made the sound clearer, sharper, as if I were being led to its source. When I reached the top landing, the light in the hallway began to flicker. Shadows moved along the walls in rhythm with the song, like figures swaying to its beat. I followed the sound to the nursery door, the one that hadn't been opened in years. It was cracked open now, just slightly. A soft glow spilled through the gap, flickering like candlelight. My throat tightened as I pushed the door open. The room was exactly as it had been left, pale blue wallpaper peeling at the edges, a mobile of wooden stars hanging crookily above the empty crib, and the faint scent of lavender that my mother used to keep in sachets under the pillows. The rocking chair in the corner was moving again, slow and steady, its shadow stretching long across the floor. The lullaby was louder here, surrounding me, coming from everywhere at once. I could almost make out words beneath the hum, two small voices whispering in unison. Calling softly, insistently, as though inviting me closer. My knees went weak. The baby monitor on the floor beside the chair flickered again, even though I had left it downstairs. It glowed once, bright enough to sting my eyes, then went dark completely. The chair stopped. The voices stopped. For a moment, there was only the sound of my heartbeat, wild and uneven. Then, from the crib, the blanket shifted, just slightly, as if something underneath had moved on its own. The next morning, I went into town because I needed answers, or maybe I just needed someone else to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. The air outside felt different, too still, too heavy for daylight. Even the sky seemed pale, washed of color, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The town hadn't changed much since I was a child. Same cracked sidewalks, same leaning street lamps, same general store with its faded sign and dusty windows. Yet when I walked through it, people looked at me differently. Eyes that lingered too long, whispers that stopped when I passed. It wasn't grief they were staring at. It was recognition mixed with something darker. They remembered my family, even if they wished they didn't. I went first to the old store where Mrs. Carmody worked. She had been my mother's neighbor for years, the kind of woman who always knew everyone's business but pretended she didn't when she saw me. Her face went pale, the color draining like ink into water. I asked if she remembered the twins, if she knew anything about what happened to them. Her lips parted, but no sound came out at first, only a soft exhale that trembled like she was trying to choose her words carefully. Then she said quietly, "Some things are better left under the earth, dear." Her voice cracked on the last word. I pressed harder, told her I'd found the graves, the attic, the photograph. She flinched at that and looked toward the window, as if checking who might be listening. "Your mother did what she had to," she whispered. "What any mother would do if she loved them enough." Before I could ask what she meant, she reached out suddenly and grabbed my wrist. Her hand was cold, trembling. "If you found their resting place, don't disturb it again. Promise me that." I didn't answer. I couldn't. There was something in her eyes, a kind of haunted recognition that made my stomach turn. I left the store without saying goodbye, the sound of the bell above the door echoing too long in the silence. Outside, an old man sitting on a bench by the post office watched me with the same look of quiet warning. When I met his eyes, he muttered under his breath, "The house still sings, doesn't it?" I froze. He smiled then, but it wasn't kind. "It sang for her, too," he added, before turning away like he'd already said too much. Every person I tried to speak with gave the same response: hesitation, discomfort, silence. No one denied that the twins had existed, but no one would talk about how they died. It was like the whole town had collectively buried not just their bodies but their truth. And the more I asked, the colder the air seemed to get, as if my questions were drawing something closer that the town had long tried to keep away. By the time I reached the church, I could see Father Doyle locking the front doors. He'd known my mother well, had performed her funeral. When I asked if he remembered blessing the graves behind our house, his hands froze mid-motion. Slowly he shook his head. "There were no graves to bless," he said, voice low, cautious. "Your mother didn't bring them here. She wouldn't let anyone see them after." He trailed off and stared past me toward the road. "You shouldn't have gone back there," he said finally. "That land was never meant for the living." When I turned to leave, something made me glance back. He was still standing at the church doors, fingers pressed to the cross around his neck, watching me like a man expecting thunder. The streets were empty by the time I started walking home. And though the sun was still up, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Not footsteps, not breathing, just the sense of something keeping pace beside me, unseen, like the town itself was trying to make sure I left before I asked one question too many. When I got back to the house, dusk was sinking in, and the light through the windows had that orange, dying glow that makes everything look like it's burning from the inside out. I tried to shake off what the townspeople had said, but their fear lingered in my head like an echo I couldn't mute. I needed something tangible, something to prove that my mother's silence hadn't been madness, that there was a reason for the secrets she guarded so fiercely. I started searching through her things again, moving through each room like I was peeling back layers of her life. The scent of lavender and dust clung to everything, and the deeper I searched, the heavier the air became. It was in her old study where I found it, a small box hidden behind the false panel of her dresser drawer. Inside were yellowed letters, a rosary missing a bead, and a single photograph folded so tightly it had nearly torn in half. When I unfolded it, my hands began to tremble. The picture showed my mother sitting in the garden, her face turned toward the camera, smiling faintly. But it wasn't her expression that froze me, it was what she was holding. Two babies, swaddled in matching blankets, each with a black ribbon tied around one wrist. They were identical, down to the curve of their lips and the faint curls of their hair. Behind her, I could make out the faint outline of the willow trees, the same ones standing over the graves now. I flipped the photograph over, hoping for names or dates, but there was nothing except a faint brown stain on the corner that looked too much like dried blood. I sat there staring at it for what felt like hours until something caught my eye, a black ribbon lying on the floor just beside the dresser. It hadn't been there before. It was the same as the ones in the photograph, long and slightly frayed, still tied neatly as though it had been around something small. I picked it up, and for a brief second, I thought I heard something faint, like a soft breath right beside my ear. The air around me chilled instantly, the kind of cold that seeps into the bones. The lamp flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging the room into shadow. My heart hammered as I reached for my phone's flashlight, its beam trembling as much as my hand. That's when I saw it, another photograph tucked beneath the box. This one was newer, color instead of black and white. My mother stood in the same garden, years older, her expression hollow. But beside her, two small figures were faintly visible, blurred and gray, like smoke given shape. One had its hand resting on her shoulder. The flashlight flickered again, and for a heartbeat, I thought I saw movement reflected in the glass frame on the wall, two small shapes standing just behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, only the slow creak of the floor settling under my weight. My breath fogged in the air. On the desk, the ribbon I'd set down began to curl slowly, as if invisible fingers were twisting it into a knot. The room grew so still that even my own heartbeat sounded foreign. Then I noticed something else. The faint scratch marks on the floor beneath the dresser, forming two parallel lines that led straight toward the hallway. I followed them, each step careful, afraid to look but more afraid to stop. The tracks ended at the base of the staircase, where another black ribbon hung loosely from the railing. My throat went dry. I remembered the one tied to my bedroom door days ago, identical to this one. Only now, there were two. One above, one below, perfectly opposite each other, like mirrors. Somewhere upstairs, something shifted, soft and deliberate, the faint creak of wood giving way beneath weight. I lifted my head, and from the top of the stairs came the sound of laughter, small, breathy, echoing faintly in pairs, as if two children were hiding in the dark, waiting for me to come find them that night. I couldn't bring myself to sleep. Every room in the house seemed to breathe differently now, the walls expanding and contracting like they were alive, listening. The ribbons were still where I'd found them, one tied neatly to the stair, railing the other on my bedroom door, and no matter how many times I told myself they were just bits of fabric, they felt like warnings. The storm outside began close to midnight, sudden and violent, shaking the windows with wind that sounded almost like a voice trying to speak through the glass. I sat awake, counting the seconds between thunder and lightning, until I heard it, the sound I had begun to dread more than anything else. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. They came from above me, from the attic, At first I tried to ignore it. Houses make sounds, old ones especially. But then the knocks came again, louder, sharper, perfectly spaced. Not the shifting of wood, not the wind, intentional. I stood up before I realized what I was doing, moving toward the stairs like something unseen was pulling me forward. The power flickered, and for a moment, the whole house went dark except for the lightning flashing through the windows, lighting up the hallway in bursts of pale blue. Between flashes, the shadows seemed to move, stretching and shrinking, and every time the light came back, I felt like they had shifted slightly closer. I reached the base of the attic stairs, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The door at the top was closed, but I could see faint movement beneath it, a soft glow seeping through the cracks like candlelight. The knocking stopped as soon as I placed my hand on the first step. For a few seconds the silence was so thick it felt almost solid. Then came the sound of something dragging across the floor above, slow and heavy, followed by the faint patter of footsteps, small, uneven, childlike. My knees went weak. The air had grown so cold I could see my breath in front of me, hanging like mist. I climbed the stairs slowly, each creak sounding too loud, the kind of sound that felt like it was alerting whatever waited above. When I reached the top, I hesitated, my fingers resting on the doorknob. It was freezing, almost burning from the cold. I whispered to myself to turn back, but before I could move, there came a sound from the other side, laughter, faint and high-pitched, echoing in pairs. One voice, then another, overlapping perfectly. The same laughter I'd heard at the base of the stairs before. The door handle began to twist beneath my fingers, not from me, but from the other side. Slowly, steadily, I stumbled back, my body locked between wanting to run and being unable to look away. The door opened just an inch, then another. The warm glow flickered out, leaving only darkness. My phone's flashlight barely pierced through it, the beam swallowed almost instantly. The attic smelled of mildew, old wood, and something sweet and rotten, like fruit left too long in the sun. I thought I saw movement at the far end of the room, something small and pale darting behind one of the shrouded furniture pieces. Then a whisper drifted out of the dark, my own name, spoken in two voices at once, soft and almost affectionate. I froze completely, and the light flickered in my hand. When it steadied again, I saw two small handprints pressed into the inside of the door, perfectly mirrored, like someone had been standing there waiting for me to open it. The attic fell silent again, except for the faint rhythm of breathing, not mine. It was slow, deliberate, coming from just beyond the light's reach, as though something stood there in the dark, unseen but near enough that I could feel the air move when it exhaled. The knocking had stopped, but whatever had started it hadn't gone away. Morning came without sunlight, only a dull gray sky pressing against the windows like fog made solid. I didn't remember falling asleep, yet I woke up on the floor beside the attic door, my neck stiff, my clothes cold with sweat. The handprints were gone, the room above silent again, but the air still carried that strange sweetness, a faint trace of decay mixed with lavender. I tried to convince myself it had all been a dream, but the bruise on my wrist where the doorknob had turned on its own said otherwise. I needed answers, something concrete, something that would explain what my mother had done and why. So I searched again, not in drawers or boxes this time, but in the spaces she'd guarded most, the hidden corners, the false walls, the quiet places where secrets survive. It was in her bedroom closet, behind a loose panel of old cedar, that I found the diary. The leather was cracked, edges curled, the pages brittle and stained in places that looked too much like tears. The first entries were mundane, weather, gardening, small notes about daily chores, but the tone changed abruptly midway through. Her handwriting grew hurried, jagged, words pressed too hard into the paper as though written by a trembling hand. She spoke of sleepless nights, of voices whispering from the walls, of songs that wouldn't stop once they began. She wrote about the twins, but never used their names. Instead, she called them the echoes. One entry in particular made my blood run cold. It was dated the week before their supposed deaths. "They don't cry anymore," she wrote. "They only stare. I hear them even when the house is quiet. Sometimes I think they aren't mine at all. Sometimes I think the house gave them to me and now it wants them back. The next page was torn halfway through, the ink smeared as though her hand had shaken while she wrote. Beneath that, in darker ink, were the words, "They should never have been born together. The doctor warned me. Two hearts too close, one always feeding on the other." The final entries became nearly illegible. Dates blurred, lines crossed out, fragments of sentences that seemed more like confessions than journal notes. They came back after I buried them. I locked the door, but they found another way in. I hear them breathing through the walls. They want to be whole again. Then a final note scrawled at the bottom, pressed so deep into the page that it left an impression on the next one. "Forgive me. I couldn't bury them both." My pulse quickened as I read those words over and over. Could it be true that only one of them had been buried? And the other? What had happened to the other? The thought made my skin crawl. I turned the page, but there were no more entries, only a photograph glued to the inside of the back cover. It showed the twins lying side by side, but this time one of them had their eyes open. They were staring straight at the camera. I dropped the book instinctively, my breath catching in my throat. The photo hit the floor face down, and when I bent to pick it up, the back of it was covered in fresh dirt like the kind I'd found around the graves. I didn't hear the footsteps at first. They were faint, careful, padding across the hallway carpet outside the room. I froze, listening, every hair on my arms rising. The sound stopped right outside the door, and then, through the thin crack at the bottom, I saw it, a small shadow, two sets of feet standing perfectly still. I waited, not breathing, clutching the diary to my chest. Then, in the softest whisper imaginable, two voices spoke at once, from the other side of the door. "You forgot one?" they said. The air in the house changed after that night. It no longer felt like it belonged to me. Every breath I took seemed borrowed, every movement echoing with the faint sound of something following just out of sight. I tried to leave, but the door refused to open. The key turned easily enough, but it was as if the lock had no intention of letting me go. Windows that should have opened with a push stayed sealed, and even the phone, fully charged, blinked to black the moment I tried to call anyone. The house was quiet, but not empty. It felt aware, like it was holding its breath again, waiting for something to happen. Waiting for me to do what my mother never finished. The diary lay open on the table, its last words burned into my mind. "Forgive me, I couldn't bury them both." I thought about the graves outside, about the uneven soil and the shallow depth, about how one seemed older than the other. My mother hadn't buried both twins, one was still here, and somehow I had brought it back. The lullaby started again just after midnight. It came softly at first, so faint I thought it was the wind, but then the melody grew clearer, threaded through the silence like a heartbeat. The sound came from the attic. I wanted to believe it was in my head, that grief had finally cracked something inside me, but the music was too real, too deliberate. It wasn't just humming anymore. There were words now, the ones my mother used to sing to me when I was small. But there were two voices again, one higher, one lower, weaving around each other in perfect sync. My hands were trembling as I picked up the flashlight, the beam slicing through the dark as I climbed the stairs. The walls seemed narrower than before, as though the house itself was leaning in. With every step, the air grew colder until my breath came out in short, visible bursts. When I reached the attic door, it was already open. The light from below flickered faintly on the first few steps, but beyond that was nothing but darkness. The lullaby stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It pressed against my ears until I could hear my own pulse. Then came the whisper. Two small voices breathing my name in perfect unison, coming from the far end of the room. I lifted the light, sweeping it across the space, and for a second, the beam landed on the old crib. The blanket inside moved. Not a flutter, not a shift from the wind. It moved like something beneath it had just turned over. I couldn't look away. My knees locked, every muscle screaming to run, but my body refused to obey. Slowly, the blanket began to slide off the crib, folding in on itself until it fell to the floor. Beneath it was the silver rattle, the one with the initials L and M. It rolled forward on its own, stopping just at my feet. I took a step back and hit something solid, the door, now closed behind me. My fingers scrambled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The flashlight flickered again, and when it steadied, Two figures stood near the crib. Small, pale, their outlines faint and flickering like candle flames in wind. I couldn't see their faces, but I didn't have to. I knew, the twins. They were smaller than I remembered from the photos, their shapes thin, almost translucent, as if the world was struggling to keep them visible. One of them tilted its head, a motion that felt wrong, too smooth, too deliberate. The other took a step forward, and though there was no sound of feet on wood, I could hear a faint breath, shallow, ragged, like something struggling to remember how to breathe. They didn't speak at first, they only stared. The light trembled in my hand, and as it did, their faces came into focus, hollow eyes, skin pale as bone, and mouths that didn't quite close. Then, together, they spoke the same phrase their voices had whispered through the walls. "You forgot one." I shook my head, my voice breaking as I tried to tell them they were buried, that I'd found their graves. But the smaller one, or maybe the younger one, if such things still mattered, reached out a hand pointing toward the floorboards beneath the crib. I followed its gesture, and my stomach turned to ice. The boards there were uneven, the nails newer than the rest. My mother's confession flashed through my mind. She couldn't bury them both. She had hidden one. I dropped to my knees, the flashlight beam sliding across the cracks as I pried at the boards with shaking fingers. The wood lifted easily, almost willingly. Beneath it was soil, fresh, dark, breathing cold air upward like the house itself was exhaling. And there, buried shallowly beneath the dirt, was another small shape wrapped in linen, still bound by a black ribbon. My throat closed. My body moved before my mind could stop it. I reached forward, brushing the dirt away until the linen gave, and the smell of age and rot hit me so hard I nearly fell back. But worse than the smell was what came next. The faint sound of something inhaling from within the shroud. Then came a voice, softer than any I had heard yet. And it came not from the attic, not from the twins before me, but from the thing beneath the floor. "You found me," it said. The flashlight fell from my hand, clattering to the floor, the beam spinning wildly until it caught the faces of the twins. They were smiling now, both of them, wide and strange, the kind of smile that didn't belong to children. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of earth and something metallic. I stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The attic walls felt closer, bending inward. The last thing I saw before the light went out completely was the two of them stepping forward together, hands reaching out toward me, whispering in a tone that almost sounded like gratitude, almost sounded like hunger, and in that moment I understood what my mother had meant when she said the dead never really left this house, because some things aren't buried, they're kept, waiting for the right blood to come home and finish what was started. So if you felt a chill climb your spine just now, then maybe you heard them too, and if you did, you should probably like, comment, and subscribe.